insights and deep dives. The DAO space is really hard to track on your own. There's so much that happens in this space, and you may just get bamboozled by the developments and the crazy happenings of forget the DAO space, the sort of events that happen in this space. But we are here with this show to talk to some of the best DAO operators and thought leaders in this space to keep you updated and to keep you savvy about what's going on in this space. My name is Abhishek Ajit, and along with me is my co-host Abhishek Sanavne. Hey Abhishek, what's up? How are you doing?
Hey man, all good. Really pumped for this one. Happy to have the guests that I've been following for some time on Twitter. And yeah, really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, this guest is someone whose content I've been following real closely on BanklessDAO as well as Quorum. She's been someone who's currently working as communications for Aragon and is now on her way to becoming like a budding inventor of the DAO operation space, having now started a meta label for called the Quorum space. I think she's even nailed the hairdo also quite a bit. Hi, Samantha Marin. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, super excited to be here today with you all.
Hey, it's a pleasure having you on the show. The main content piece that really got me following you was the main piece of why we are actually doing this episode, and that is having a hard convo, building better compensation frameworks for DAO operators. For listeners who are just tuning in now, this piece came in at a time DAO compensation discussions were just restricted to purely what's going on within each DAO forums per se. And there wasn't a lot of broad compensation discussions that you would see. And when this piece came out, it was like like an eye opener for me. Just clarified a lot of things about how DAOs in general should be thinking about compensations. And I believe that if the DAO revolution has to really scale, in my head, I see 50,000 DAOs, 100,000 DAOs as being very small numbers. For that to happen, we need to be having that sort of serious conversations about compensation. And none better than Samantha over here, who's done quite a bit of thinking and has lived through the whole DAO experience herself, ready to share in her views. Samantha, before we get into your background, I overheard your convo with Humpty Calderon from Crypto Sapiens, and you mentioned that you worked at a startup prior to getting into the DAO space. Now, you've seen both sides of the aisle, both Web 2 and Web 3. How has your experiences shaped your views and your outlook on DAO compensation lately, especially the whole Web 2 side of things and how DAO compensation as a whole currently?
Yeah, definitely. So before I got into the DAO space, I was working at a Web 2 startup, like Web 2 technology startup, and it was a lot closer to the more traditional Web 2. You get paid a salary, and maybe if you're lucky, you'll get like 0.5% equity kind of thing. Like you'll get 0.5% of the company. And that was something that didn't fully sit right with me. I was learning about DAOs and crypto at the same time while I was working at this startup. And when I joined BanklessDAO, I got tipped in bank token I think it was just 5 or 10 minutes after even introducing myself. And I was like, I'm already an owner of this organization I literally just joined. Even though my ownership at that time was 0.000 whatever, because I got 5 bank tokens, it was still really impactful for me. And so I think coming from the Web 2 startup world, I realized that having ownership over your project early and then having a way to really grow that ownership over time, I think is super, super valuable for helping contributors feel like really connected to their work, feel like their work has value, feel like they have more control over it. At the same time, the other side of that is that I don't think all your payment should be in ownership. Like all your payment shouldn't be in governance tokens or equity. So then that kind of brings in the more Web 2 lens of getting more of a traditional salary. So yeah, for me, I think it's really like a mix, like best of both worlds is what I'm trying to look at now.
Absolutely. I listened to your story now, and you realize how important ownership has been for you personally, how that whole piece of the puzzle was an important catalyst for why you shifted to DAOs in the first place. It's not much you're asking. You're putting in the work for this. And why shouldn't you be entitled to the piece of what you've put in the effort for? And in that sense, DAOs have really been a game changer that way. They not only provide not just a salary, but then they give you the broader ownership of the fruit of the labor, not just
Yeah.
the cost, but the fruit of the labor. And that is not just decided by a lead, that is decided by the overall collective itself. And what
Hmm.
we've seen with DAOs that's really exciting and it's much of difference is you can negotiate how much you're paid with your lead. Okay, if you know that you have some sort of value, you can negotiate that. But when you're part of a collective, you get to be a voice for deciding how much you are paid within this collective. Now, is that the same across the board? No, it is not. But for listeners who don't understand why, I think we will get into that. When Samantha, when you look at the DAO space right now, there is a lot of difference in which compensation is taken care of across the board. You want to bring in a sort of collective equality, and at the same time, there is a sort of standard that comes in for workers across the globe. Now, if you are a startup, not a startup, I would say that a team that's looking to make this DAO into a cohesive and sustainable unit, you have to be mindful of the financial aspect as well as making it clear for making it more equitable for DAO contributors. What has been your outlook on what are the variables that go into factoring in that sort of compensation structures before people really start getting paid?
Yeah, yeah. Right now, the DAO space operates mostly with bounties and with kind of micro roles. So bounties are like the freelance style of work where you get paid to do one task. And then if you want to get paid more, you need to do another task. Like it's not consistent, it's just picking things up. It's very much being like a freelance writer or something where you get paid per article. Then there are payments that come in like micro roles. So maybe this was how I got started in DAOs. I was a talent scout. I think the role was maybe 8 hours a week, 8 to 10 hours a week. So not even really a part-time job level, very much micro role level. So I got paid for that hourly. DAOs haven't really graduated to the level of saying, okay, how are we going to pay people a full-time salary to be with this one organization full-time? Because maybe this person is extremely mission aligned, maybe they're really good at what they do, maybe the DAO could struggle if they decide to go somewhere else, kind of thing. DAOs haven't really graduated to that level yet. It's a lot more fluid and free flowing, and people have to kind of puzzle piece these micro roles and bounties together in order to make a full-time salary. So that's the state, I'd say, of DAO compensation right now. I'd say for DAOs getting started, really starting with a small group and starting with a clear framework and building from there for that small group. So I'll make that more concrete. Where I started in Bankless, it was like a huge DAO with tons of people. And it was more of, we have all these people, we have to work backwards and figure out how to pay them, as opposed to maybe if you're starting small, you can test and iterate a framework and build on that as you scale. So I think I've been taking a bit more of a traditional view, at least for payment, because I see that for DAOs to reach the mainstream, like they're going to have to mature in the way that they pay people, basically. So yeah, that's where I'm at with that.
Absolutely. I feel that when you talk about last year itself, people were just starting to find their footing. They understood that every aspect of decision making should have been to the collective. And as you rightly mentioned, that Bankless, they were going through that bounty system as well. But gradually, that sort of compensation structure started finding a kind of concrete angle where it made sense financially and it was equitable enough for contributors to come in and feel that they're part of the decision making. It's fair for them, and they're also being given that sort of ownership on a broader level. I think you see it from a compensation framework. It is a sort of puzzle that you need to solve. I think one
Mm-hmm.
of the best DAOs that have really thought hard about it, no offense to Bankless, but then taking a look at the DAO space, someone who's it a lot is Index Group.
Mm,
When you
yeah.
take a look at the way their compensation structure is finalized, there is a tier that's given for a core team. Essentially, the core team is given out salaries, but then their entire organization is also divided according to core team and tiers of, like, you can call them coups, like silver,
Right.
bronze, and gold. And according to each tier, each coup has the opportunity to decide whether they want the whole compensation aspect to be a collaborative approach, or it should be like a core team approach. So it gives
Hmm.
these teams the flexibility to decide ki if the collaborative approach is too time taking and it's not worth the effort, then it's
Hmm.
best to stick to that a person who is part of the team to decide what sort of money should be doled out to each person. But if the money is variable and you have a lot of you have these core contributors who are not part of the core team come in, then those contributors can have the option to decide if they want to be a part of a coordinate circle, or they want to be able to find other ways of deciding how that money should be allocated. And a budget is given from the leads to these people. And there is a broader collective decision making across about how this whole process is oriented depending on a snapshot vote. I think Pepperoni Joe also came out with a lot of iterations on how this organizational design should work and came to a lot of snapshot votes. So, on a broad aspect, this is how it works. What I find exciting about this is the granular detail in which decision making you have the choice. You have the choice of
Hmm.
having a tier of core compensation. You have the choice of making it a collaborative approach. But you don't see that with the trad world. My question is, Samantha, this aspect of collaborative approach of deciding compensation, that's very rare in the trad world. It's something that we are seeing where it's like a common thing now. It's not surprising to see a DAO having a coordinate circle. What has been the impact of that collaborative approach with decision making for compensation? How does it affect a contributor in terms of making an impact? From the collective standpoint, it's like these people are all getting together and deciding how much they all should be getting paid. How does it
Hmm.
affect them from a financial cohesion and from a financial stability perspective and from a broader collective impact? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. One big kind of unlock to start with is just the compensation transparency. Most Web2 companies, you still have no idea what your coworkers are getting paid. Like, just the comp transparency in itself is like great. I think when organizations don't share compensation transparently, it often leads to unfair compensation or just structures that have historically kept people or prevented people from making their full potential, their salary, or moving up in their career and things like that. So yeah, 100%. I think the collaborative approach brings that transparency piece, which is super important. I also think it brings more of a feedback piece. So coordinate, where at the end of every season, you allocate these give tokens to other contributors and you allocate them based on how valuable you saw that contributor's work and how much they helped you, things like that. And then those give tokens translate into the DAO's native token and then gets distributed. So I think that collaborative approach, you get a lot of feedback on your work. I had a really strong season. I maybe impacted this one person in a much stronger way that I didn't realize, or oh, maybe it wasn't as good of a season for me. Maybe I was distracted with other things. Like that peer-to-peer feedback, I think is really like incredible, honestly. Like Coordinate is so cool. Doing your whole compensation coordinate, I think that's a terrible idea. It should be like bonuses on top. It should be like low stakes, like fun and free flowing. But one thing I think that is lost with the collaborative coordinate or collaborative compensation setting is the idea of experience and like your background. So when I say background, I mean like your professional background and the experience you bring to the table. So in traditional compensation structures, someone with 10 years of experience gets paid more than someone with 5 years of experience. That's not always a fair structure based on the work that they're actually doing. But in a lot of situations, the person with 10 years of experience is bringing so much knowledge to the table that the person with 5 years doesn't have, and they can't replicate that. They just don't have that knowledge. And so I think that's something DAOs really lose. Like they take the knowledge piece out of it, which is like good in some aspects for like fairness and equality, but very bad in other situations when you actually do need that like professional knowledge. So yeah, that's my flyover, the coordination aspect.
I think that aspect of factoring in experience within that sort of circles, I think that's a point that a lot of DAOs actually miss. You're right about that. You zone in on the value of the work, but you don't like really see. Like for example, I remember this. I don't know whether you call it a joke or not, but there's this guy who considers the price of getting the plumbing done for $10. But when he goes to a plumber and gets the work done from that particular plumber, the plumber asks for $200, and the guy's like, "Why are you charging me $200? It's like I was expecting
Mm-hmm.
around $30 or something." The plumber
Mm-hmm.
says, "You see the value of the work, that $30, but you don't see the 5 years that went into that kind of resulted in $200. I got this
Yeah.
done in 10 minutes because I spent 10 years getting it done. Had you gotten it done from the outside market, you wouldn't have gotten it done at that speed. I'm paraphrasing extra here, but the point
Mm-hmm.
is, it makes a lot of sense here. But that brings in a question here. DAOs have like really tried to reshape how you value an activity. How do you value the work that's done? And in that
Mm-hmm.
regard, you've broken that sort of pieces down, and you have these sort of experiments that kind of come into play. And there has been a lot of good experiences. Sometimes I hear a lot of good things about people feel valued. They are part of the whole decision making thing because they are being part of the whole process. They get to decide how much money makes sense for them, and overall it comes to some sort of an allocated number. But on the other hand, you have stuff like this. An experienced writer putting in that sort of effort doesn't get that sort of recognition from the broader circle. You have issues of popularity contests coming in, and most importantly, we are in the DAO space. We are dealing with the frontier of cutting edge tech. What we are doing, there is no basis, there is no some sort of standard that we could compare broadly to other startups. You've mentioned this a lot in your piece also. I would like to understand, how should lead who is tackling this sort of compensation deal with this sort of conundrum? What's the best way to value that sort of work? And what's the best balance to have that sort of core
Mm-hmm.
compensation? Makes sense that way. Core compensation, what should be?
Yeah. So I think starting at the guild or the working group level, I think is where the compensation structure should come from. I don't think it should be a top-down thing coming from the DAO as a whole entity. Like you're never going to be able to design a framework that works for every single guild or sub DAO in your organization. And that's the issue of Web 2, right? Is they have these HR groups that are trying to create a very top-down approach when what actually needs to happen is a more like organic approach coming out from teams. So I think starting with that, a team lead would essentially like assess kind of work from, okay, what do we need to do? And then what are the pieces we need to put in place to achieve those goals? Maybe one team is shipping a product and they say, okay, we need these 5 roles in order to, we need a project manager, we need an engineering lead, probably going to need a lot more than 5 people, but say we need these 5 roles, and then start with designing those and then get smaller and smaller out. So like bounties and micro roles are more on the outer side. I think an issue a lot of DAOs have is they put bounties at the center, and that makes it more of a transactional relationship where there are people coming in and out constantly. The quality of work is significantly decreased because people aren't with the organization, so they just don't have the context they need. But if you put the core team at the center, they are paid a salary that is in their choice, their mix of stables and governance and things like that. Like they can choose their sort of like risk exposure. And then to support those, say, 5 core team members, then you say, okay, we're going to add in a couple micro roles, we're going to add in a bounty program, but more designing a way to support those core contributors as opposed to supporting bounties from like a huge distributed community.
You factored in bounties as a major piece of the puzzle. Bounties tend to bring in a lot of people that just let it come and go. It's like a mercenary type mentality. That's what I tend to hear from a lot of DAOs that have this approach. But then when you do factor in this coordinate and source creds kind of type of approach, there are a couple of loopholes there also that should be factored in that a lot of people just don't feel comfortable with. For example, what are the mechanisms like to ensure for conflict resolution when you are part of a circle? Say, for example, see, it's about allocation here, right? So when you have the gift tokens, you don't get to keep any part of those gift tokens. You're supposed to give it off to your people within that scene. So it's about, so that gift tokens that you're talking about, in the end, it's a score of how other people view your work. It's not the major value about what, it's not what you see your value of the work is, it's how other people see your work. So when that happens, how do you kind of have that sort of conflict resolution in place where an individual can just step up and say, maybe that these people, how they've viewed it is wrong. I want a better pay. How do you resolve that better in a democratic setting like this? And that's one, the conflict resolution piece. And second, we want DAOs to scale, and this sort of duration that it takes for compensation to be decided also takes up a lot of bandwidth. So how do you decide the sort of duration that makes sense for collaborative decision making, that makes it equitable, but you don't want a lot of bandwidth to be lost from key activities itself, no? Because compensation is a tough convo. You have it as a title. People don't want to indulge in hard convos all the time. In the end, they got to have a good time working for what they matter. So how do you put in that sort of conflict resolution, and what are the durations you need to keep in place for deciding out these sort of compensation related stuff?
Yeah, talking about money is taboo. Like, it's so hard to have these conversations, Web 2, Web 3, wherever, with your group of friends. They're hard, like, no matter what. So I think for the conflict resolution, just expressing your like unhappiness with your compensation structure as early as you can, and in a very controlled and kind manner, because we're on the internet. It's so easy to be mean when you're typing something. Like, you need to schedule a call or some kind of one-on-one interaction with maybe your guild coordinator. DAOs are not leaderless organizations. There's always someone you can talk to who's a leader. You know, sometimes there are like trained facilitators floating around. I think we have a couple of those at Aragon who are trained in this conflict mediation. So yeah, definitely actually speaking with someone rather than just letting it kind of fester and then eventually just like typing something terrible out. Because it's just, if you've seen Twitter and YouTube comments, it's just so easy to go off. So I'd say that would be my approach to getting your compensation elevated if you need to. And then for the bandwidth issue, I'd say that involving everyone on every discussion is just a recipe for burnout. Just trying to get everyone involved in every operational like piece is just going to be totally insane. Like, some people are going to care a lot about some pieces. Some people are just not going to care at all and say, I have a lot of work to do, I don't have time for this. So I would say keeping it simple, and maybe every season kind of revisiting it. Don't constantly revisit it, because that's just gonna burn you out. But maybe every season, quarter, whatever time block you kind of use to structure your organization, revisiting it, seeing if it still resonates with everybody, if it still works with everybody. I think starting, and this can go with a conflict resolution question as well, but something I've seen done that I think is pretty smart is everyone puts the amount of working time they dedicate to that organization. So someone who's full-time in that organization, doesn't work anywhere else, very abnormal in Web3. They would be 100%. Someone who maybe splits their time between another DAO or a Web2 job or something, they might be 50% or 40%. And so you can scale compensation based on the amount that you put into that organization. And so that can be a more objective place to land with compensation, because a lot of times you get into these very subjective conversations and you feel like you're getting personal, you're talking about yourself and your own personal value, but what you should really be talking about is like the work and the role, and it's really hard to separate yourself personally from that. So I think that kind of scaling method can be really helpful. And then to get more money on top of that, you use the bonusing systems, coordinate and source credit like you're talking about. But I think that scaling method can be really helpful.
Absolutely. And along with that, you mentioned that for that conflict resolution process, what I see a lot of DAOs do is when things get dicey within the coordinate circle, they have a certain bunch of people who come in as an audit or as a conflict resolution, someone who's not part of that broader circle,
Right.
to come in and take a stand on if there's any sort of issue. Sometimes it's just a lead who takes the call. Otherwise, it's a bunch of people who come in as a third party observer. I mean, someone from within the DAO itself, but uh, if DAOs have that sort of roles within the system, I think that can lead to a lot of the tensions being mitigated that way. Along with, I think we made a good point about not having to revisit it again and again unless it's a broader circle or a broader collective issue that people are just not getting paid and the whole process is not working out. Then you don't need to fix what's not broken. Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But then one question that comes into play is the way uh, these contributors do come into getting paid is how they get paid. You take a look at the trad world, it's just the fiat currency. If I go and ask for a mixture of crypto and fiat, it's still difficult to do that, even if I work for a Web3 company. Forget. So in trad world, you get fiat. But when you talk about crypto, the DAO space, there's a, depending on certain DAOs, you do have the flexibility to decide what you get paid in. You
Right.
have the option of getting paid in native, you have the option of getting paid in your USD, and some DAOs even go bend over backwards to allow for that sort of swaps where they are able to pay their contributors in the token of their choice. That is a level of flexibility you give people over here. But then it begs the question, because I worked for a DAO tool before that dealt with compensation, making that sort of compensation flexibility available to contributors is not easy. There's a lot of gas fees that's getting involved, the figuring out which contributor has to get paid and what. There's a lot of admin overhead, there's gas overhead, there's so much to consider. But at the same time, you have to accommodate what contributors want for the sake of their own satisfaction. What do you think are the best practices that DAO should kind of indulge in? I mean, what's worked out in your eyes?
Yeah, I think, well, the elephant in the room is that most DAOs aren't profitable. And so it's pretty hard to pay contributors in a mix of currencies if the DAO is holding most of their treasury in their native token. So that's more like a Web2 startup, like pre-seed environment of like sweat equity. Like you're getting paid in equity or the native token. And theoretically, if the DAO is successful, then that will pay off for you. Really, we've seen that native tokens trade completely linked to the greater market. They're pretty linked to ETH, and so if ETH is going down, your native token's probably going down, and vice versa. So that hasn't really played out exactly, and like the DAO being successful equals like token price go up. That just doesn't exist right now. So that's a little iffy. I think giving contributors choice is the ideal situation, but I think that for that to happen in reality, you have, like you said, you have to have a ton of admin work going on, and you just need to be bringing in revenue. Unless you're really good at DeFi and farming and you have some asset managers making a bunch of money off of your native tokens. Yeah, I think it's a little like DAOs are a little behind that right now.
Another thing that forget the profitability part. I think another piece of the puzzle is the tokens are volatile.
Yeah.
And
So volatile.
that scares a lot of people. Contributors want all that upside. They want to be getting that ownership. But when the downside comes, then they'll be like, let's go back home. This is not our game.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and it's understandable for contributors who rely on that sort of money for taking care of their expenses. You can't blame them, right? So that's been one factor that plays out, that how do you balance out the need for ownership with the need for stability. You have a trilemma there. It works out when you see it from deciding what value to pay out and deciding what sort of token to pay out. There's a factor for ownership, what sort of ownership these people need, the sort of stability that's necessary for both the collective as well as for the financial aspect of contributors, and the broader impact that you see. So when you take a look at that, depending on the bear market itself, when the bull market came in and when people started noticing that, okay, this whole DAO space is sort of growing, let's just be a part of this movement and grow with it. So when the token prices started growing, you had a lot of these people getting into the bank tokens. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
money just went into that. As the token prices went up, so did their ownership, the benefit of that. So a lot of people just went and took these bank tokens. But bear market, everybody wants to go into stables. So
Right.
lately, a lot of people, what they do is, a lot of these communities now prefer to have this mix where 70% of their money is going into stables, and probably 30%, that's your variable part, goes into these ownership tokens, your bank tokens or your DAO tokens, so that they don't feel like they're losing out on the ownership part. Not everything
Mm-hmm.
has to go to the VC at the end, right? So in that aspect, it's pretty cool. Even though a contributor retains that sort of that choice, but in the end, people want to be getting that sort of stability during the bear market, and that's what I've seen with these communities. A lot, even when you see Yearn, what they've done lately is they allow for people to have that sort of choice. There's a core compensation that goes into it, but they also have a broader rainy fund, like in case things get bad. They have a whole fund of almost 18 months worth of salary for the broader collective itself, so that things work out. And all of that is
Wow.
factored. Yeah. Why aren't these conversations coming out across the broader DAO space? Stepping back for a minute, we'll come back to this point of having a rainy fund type of situation. But do you think compensation across the DAO spectrum is transparent? What's going on with the startup world? There is some attempts made to understand, okay, fine, you have Glassdoor, you understand what are the broad values of, if there's a marketing price, you have an idea that, okay, fine, it costs probably 150 grand in a year. I'm just making up numbers. But why aren't we seeing that sort of discussions across the DAO space? I see that a lot of the discussions tend to come from certain Twitter accounts who make up a Google sheet, and I don't see the
Right.
data at the end of it at the end.
Yeah.
In the end, even though we call ourselves this collective, this Web3 ecosystem, yet these conversations, the broad data of what's going on in the DAO space don't really come out in the open. And why has that gap continued to exist?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Compensation is theoretically transparent. You can chase down anyone's wallet address or .eth address on a block explorer that you want and go backwards and figure stuff out like that. But as far as industry-wide standards, there just aren't really any. I have seen what you're describing, like the spreadsheet thing, where people say, do you work in Web3? Do you work in DAOs? Put your role and then your salary. I think part of the reason it's not super transparent in DAOs is because people are piecing together these bounties and micro roles. So it's almost too niche and too specific to say, oh, I do marketing for this DAO and I make X salary a year. It's too, the reality is you're picking up maybe 20 bounties over the year. Maybe you're putting together 4 different micro roles. Maybe you have a little marketing side gig that pays really well that kind of comes in. So I think it's too fragmented to really have a broad, transparent salary standard. I think that is starting to come though in the more like Web3 traditional company environment. So Aragon straddles these two. It has like DAO and a more traditional side to it. I'm seeing more of the salary transparency, and this is what someone who does marketing in Web3 would get paid. I'm seeing more of that coming from the traditional pipeline of companies rather than the DAO pipeline because of that fragmentation.
Exactly. I think one more aspect that you mentioned is that every collective has their own way of piecing together how compensation is done.
Yeah.
You're right. No, it's not just about the bounties, it's just not about the micro roles. It's just how each community tends to see the compensation part. And I think that's fair. I also feel that you have collectives for research, you have collectives where tools are coming together for making that sort of search for tooling and all of that. Just don't see that sort of organization of contributors or just DAOs just coming together to piece it all together. Even though you have the way you view compensation may different, but in the end, there should be a broader collective by which you should be able to assess whether the value of that money is it equitable or not. Is it hitting that standard or not? I think we haven't seen that sort of organized effort yet. I don't think it's only been a certain researcher or someone who's interested. We've not seen a broad outfit just come and piece it all together.
Right.
One DAO that's really taking the effort of doing that to some extent is probably Marin DAO. They are working on a reward and compensations guidebook, and I think we will see a lot of research on how the contribution compensation spans across the ecosystem. I think that's pretty exciting. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think down the road also that'll be pretty interesting set of data to look at. Just coming and stepping back for a minute, you have the way the compensation discussion has gone about. It's all about how each group kind of views their compensation as equitable or not. But Samantha, you're going to be running a meta label of your own in a bit. Lot of contributors coming in. It's not just about the contributors at each circle down. It's about whether the collective as a whole is financially stable or not. It's about, are we hitting our numbers from a financial standpoint? Because you take a look at the broad financial numbers, contributions take up a major chunk of that. You take any tech company for that matter, a huge proportion of the expenses goes towards, and especially during a time like this, the bear market, you see a lot of layoffs happening for that reason.
Right.
Because compensation just tends to be too expensive and you got to conserve. But the whole discussion has been about how to make compensation equitable about that. So if you were running this DAO, how do you have this sort of discussion with your broader contributors about what makes sense financially and how to set the compensation accordingly when things get tough? How do you kind of set the numbers when contributors are not hitting the mark, in terms of making an impact? How do you see that from a broad collective?
Yeah, definitely. The approach I'm taking with the meta label is scaling very slowly and not scaling beyond
It
what
was
we're
just an
able.
analogy. I'm not
Yeah,
expecting you
no,
to come on.
of course. I'm just saying that's like my ideal is to add like we're gonna like slowly add like one creator at a time who's like very value aligned and produces really high quality work, and then like we can all continue to be financially stable together as we grow. But if I had an organization that was going under in the bear market and I had to figure out what to do, I think I think the best way to really handle that is to bring everyone together and just be realistic and explain what's happening and say, okay, everyone's either going to have to go part-time or we're going to have to cut half of you, and just say, like, what are we going to do? What do you all think? What is the best thing to do? And of course, like making a really hard decision like that in the end probably has to be on the founders or the core team to make the final call. But as far as getting feedback and bringing people in the loop so they don't feel like they're in the dark, I think that's a good way to do it. And just being real, like, hey, this is a really hard decision. Like, no one wants to do this kind of thing. I think that could be a good way to approach it.
Yeah, absolutely. You have that sort of transparency within that collective. You tend to see the community rally in. But for most of these DAOs, that's not the case, right? It's all everyone within the coordinate circle gets to decide who gets paid or not. But when the bear market hits, core team just comes in and says, you get fired, you get fired. And it's
Mm,
just nobody thinks about the decentralization part at that point, right? All about
yeah.
kind of covering that sort of making sure that whole financial stability comes in.
I just have a take there. So I had noticed that when I was working with this human resources company back in 2022, that time when the COVID lockdown hit, a lot of so business was like grinding to a halt. So to even we had to back then had to do a lot of and layoffs and all of that. So the strategy that the team took then was like the leadership started by taking a pay cut. So that's how they inspired the employees to go ahead and take a cut, voluntary pay cut. So that way we can keep the organization sustainable. Do you think this is a good practice that the space should adopt?
Yeah, lead by example. Like I said, DAOs have tons of leaders inside of them. There's always a group, even though they might not be easy to identify at first. As soon as you're working in the DAO, like you can really see who those leaders are. And yeah, just like the pay cut story you just shared, or just being really as transparent and realistic as possible with the greater market conditions for sure.
DAOs kind of being transparent about these sort of things across organizations. You just see what's working out for those DAOs and just take a call. And Samantha, best example is Bankless. The way the contributors have rallied in accepting that it's the bear market and why they would take that sort of lower compensation in terms of bank. I've seen that, especially with respect to a lot of proposals. And when you have that sort of ownership invested, I think the broader collective will have the mentality to take the right call. It's just that you need to be transparent about it. What seeds the root of tension is that these calls are taken so suddenly without the broader
Right.
collective being a part of that decision making process. It's one day you get a mail at 2:30 in the morning saying that that's not the sort of approach that tends to work out with the broader collective, right? In that sense, when you have these sort of proposals come into the group that way, and people are able to assess that yes, this is how the financial stability is. If they are able to understand and if they are able to be taught that yes, this is how the financial stability is, this is how what we need to get there. We may need to lose out a little in the short term, but if we are able to take the right call, we may survive as a collective and we are able to take it forward. I think
Yeah.
that's what makes the best approaches that way. And before we wrap up the convo, which DAOs do you think are really role models when it comes to setting the standard for compensation? And if any other DAO was to says, okay, fine, I should come up with a compensation structure, I should study from these people.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a lot of answers, unfortunately. I think one that I keep coming back to is an old article that DAO House put out. I'm not sure if they still use this structure, but I thought it was really interesting. That's where the kind of the scaling idea comes from that I was talking about earlier. And I mentioned this in the article, where the way that they handle their compensation is kind of base is in stable coins and it's scaled to how much time you're spending. Are you 100% in the DAO? Are you 30%? It's scaled to that. And then bonus is coordinate and governance tokens. And so you're getting your stable coins that are reflective of the amount of time you're spending in the DAO. And then to go above and beyond, you then get governance power on top of that. As far as that getting applied to different fields, so for example, like a Solidity developer is much more in market and higher paid than maybe a copywriter. And so how does that scale? That's like a whole other layer that you then need to apply onto this compensation system. But I think doing a base of stables and then all of your governance is this like bonus is generally the way to go. And Aragon's structured a lot more like that, where we're getting paid in stable coins, and then the ANT or Aragon Network token, that is a bonus that you get more of the longer you stay, and it's streamed to you over time. So it's totally like transparent on the blockchain, like streamed to you every block kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's what I would go with. A little more traditional of an outlook, but still has the flexibility of the DAO space, still has the feedback from Coordinate, and still has the flexibility to be part of different organizations rather than just working at one.
Absolutely, especially for core functions, which is not like a broader marketing angle. You just can't escape that sort of core compensation when you have some degree of the whole variables part. where people get to decide, okay, how's this person been from a cultural standpoint? How's this person been from a team standpoint? When you consider the tier factor of them being there from a tenure standpoint, all of that just comes into play from the coordinate standpoint. Index Group is a good example of that. They do a good job of that. Would love to check into what Aragon's been up to. Would definitely do that after the episode's done. Then from your piece also, I think Cabin and DAO House has been really doing a lot of thought leadership on that part. And Spencer Graham also brought a good article that it got published in the Defiant about how to view compensation, and that's pretty neat. With that, I think we come to a close. It's been a deep convo about compensations in general. I think the space needs to have a lot of conversations about that to bring in that sort of equitability, to bring in that sort of ease with which DAOs can steal the communities. Because if you don't have that sort of compensation structure, communities are just not going to stick around a lot. And there has to be a lot of thought that has to be dwelt into this. And you've done a lot of good work in that regard. And it's a pleasure having you on this episode. Thank you so much for doing this. Where can people follow you to get your insights and a little bit of alpha for the Cleat podcast? What do we expect out of Quorum down the road?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks for having me. This was super fun. I'm on Twitter at Samantha J. Marin. Quorum is also on Twitter at Quorum Media XYZ. And then you can find, and yeah, future for the metal label, pretty exciting. So right now it's just me and Brandon, who's a podcast host, but we'll be doing a lot more collaborative work between the two of us, which I'm really stoked on, and eventually onboarding more creators. So keep you updated on that.
Oh, amazing. Looking forward to the work that you all have been doing. Brandon, especially, he's a good podcast host.
Yeah.
Really been an inspiration for our content direction as well.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.